news editor here at Ballotpedia. We are 19 days away, if my math is correct, from the end of voting in the 2020 general elections, and it is going to be a very busy fall in the political world. In many states, early voting or absentee voting has already started, and some states have revised their election procedures due to the coronavirus pandemic, and that's causing certain states to report an increased demand for mail-in ballots. So there's a whole lot of news and a whole lot of activity going on. And although voting will continue through November 3rd, the counting of those votes and obviously the analysis of them could stretch into December. So there's a lot happening. Now, in addition to the President of the United States, the voters will also decide 35 out of 100 members of the U.S. Senate, all 435 members of the U.S. House. There are 11 state governors up for election. 86 state legislative chambers are holding elections. And there's much, much more, including ballot measures, both statewide and local, and also local races. So with all of those elections, we here at Ballotpedia are getting very excited. And what better outlet for that excitement is to share some of that information with you here today. And helping me to do that is David Luchs, who is the team lead on Ballotpedia's Marquee team. So thank you very much for being here, David.
Well, thanks for having me on, Dave. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So in this briefing, we're going to be looking at battleground races for the U.S. Senate and House, as well as at the state level. I do want to mention off the top that we're focusing on those races and not the presidential race in today's webinar. So with that being said, let's just start at the top and work our way down with the United States Senate, known as the world's greatest deliberative body. So heading into the election, Republicans have a 53-seat majority, and the Democrats directly control or have party affiliation of 45 of those members, and then the remaining 2 seats are held by independents who caucus with Democrats. So if Republicans gain some seats, or if they lose fewer than 3 net seats, they will keep control of the Senate. If the Democrats gain exactly 3 seats, control of the Senate will be split, meaning whoever is the next vice president will have plenty of opportunity to exercise a tie-breaking vote in terms of the structure and partisan organization of the Senate, as well as any other measures that may happen during that vice president's term. And then if the Democrats gain more than 3 net seats, they will control the chamber. So as you can see, those are the different scenarios. There are 33 seats that are up for regular election, and then there are 2 special elections, one in Arizona and one in Georgia. And those special elections could result in the partisan balance of the chamber changing early, because special election winners are seated as soon as those results are certified rather than in January. So there's just so much going on that maybe, you know, we haven't even thought about, or maybe you haven't even thought about. So, and also you have another factor is that both the regular and the special elections in Georgia, there are 2 Senate seats up for election in Georgia this year, they have the potential to go to a runoff. So from a partisan risk standpoint, Republicans have a little bit of greater partisan risk. They are defending 23 seats relative to 12 for the Democrats. So David, with all of that backdrop and with all of that information, what can you tell us about some of the Senate battlegrounds that are going to be decided in 2020?
Well, Dave, out of the 35 Senate seats that are up, Ballotpedia has identified 16 Senate seats as battlegrounds. These are the seats that we assess as having a really good chance to potentially change partisan control as a result of this election. Of those 16 seats, 12 of them are currently held by Republicans, and 4 of them are currently held by Democrats. One of the things that we looked at when we were putting these ratings together were election forecasts that were put out by a set of 3 U.S. Senate forecasters, one being the Cook Political Report, Inside Elections being the second, and Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball being the third. Now, there are 3 of these Senate battlegrounds that are particularly interesting because these are seats that each of those forecasters agree is actually more likely to flip than not. It's more likely to change partisan control than to stay under the current party. So one of those seats is held by a Democrat. That would be the Senate seat in Alabama, currently held by Senator Doug Jones, forecasters are saying that more likely than not, that seat will be won by the Republican candidate, Tommy Tuberville. The situation is reversed in Arizona and Colorado, where Republican senators Martha McSally and Cory Gardner, the forecasters say, are more likely to lose their seats to Democratic challengers than to win re-election. Now, there are 3 states from among these 16 battlegrounds that have particularly competitive Senate races that I'd like to really look at today. And those are Iowa, Maine, and Georgia. These are some of the really interesting races.
All right, and I know you and I could probably talk about this for hours, but we're going to try to limit it a little bit. So let's start with Iowa. So you have Republican Senator Joni Ernst. She's running for re-election. She was first elected in 2014, and she faces 3 challengers. The Democrat in the race is Teresa Greenfield. There's also a Libertarian candidate, Rick Stewart, and an independent candidate, Suzanne Herzog. So what can you tell us about this race?
Well, when Ernst was first elected in 2014, she actually flipped a Senate seat that Democrats had held since 1984, and now the party is looking to try and take that seat back. Recent statewide elections in Iowa have favored Republicans. When Ernst first won the seat in 2014, she got 52% of the vote to Democrat Bruce Braley's 44%. 2 years later, in the presidential election, President Trump defeated Hillary Clinton in Iowa with 51% of the vote to 42%. And Iowa really is a very high temperature political battleground. Iowa has 31 pivot counties. That's the most of any state. Just as a reminder, pivot counties are those counties that voted for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, and then flipped over to Donald Trump in 2016. There's 206 of them nationally, 31 of them are in Iowa. And right now, all 3 of the forecasting bodies we're looking at are calling this race a toss-up, and it really is going to come down to Ernst and Greenfield, and it could be either one of them at this point.
Yes, and Democrats, I think Tom Harkin was the senator that held that seat for quite a long time. And as you say, it's been a busy political year in Iowa with the Iowa caucuses happening earlier this year. Yes, that was still in 2020, believe it or not. All right, so that's a race we're definitely going to be keeping a close eye on. I think everyone will. Now let's move quite a bit east and look to the state of Maine, where incumbent Republican Susan Collins faces 6 challengers on the ballot. And that includes Democrat Sarah Gideon, who is the Speaker of the State House. So what else can we expect from that race?
Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting race. Susan Collins was first elected to the Senate in 1996, and she has won re-election by larger and larger margins in every year since. Most recently, in 2014, she won re-election with 67% of the vote to Democrat Shenna Bellow's 31%. Now, Maine's recent statewide electoral history has been a little more mixed. In the 2016 presidential election, Hillary Clinton won the state 48% to 45%. Maine had an election for governor in 2018, and the Democratic candidate won that race. Interestingly, Maine is actually one of 2 states that Hillary Clinton won in 2016, where a Republican senator is up for re-election this year, the other one being Colorado. And the forecasters are a little mixed on this one. The predictions have ranged from everything from this race being a toss-up to Sarah Gideon, the Democratic candidate, being a slight favorite. One really interesting complicating factor in this race is Maine's adoption of ranked choice voting. So this is a different system for casting and tallying votes, where rather than voters picking their preferred candidate, instead they actually rank each candidate, first, second, third, etc. Initially, the votes are counted with each voter's first place candidate. If one candidate is the first place of 50% or more of voters, that's great, they win. If not, what happens is the last place candidate is eliminated from the tally, and their voters' second place votes are then distributed to their second place choices. And that process continues until one candidate eventually does end up with 50% of the vote. Now, Maine did use this ranked choice voting system in 2018. That was the year that the state adopted it. They did have a Senate election that year, but the use of ranked choice voting actually did not impact the outcome. The incumbent Angus King won 54% of the vote in the first round. But this year, with 7 candidates on the ballot and a close election already in the cards, ranked choice voting could absolutely influence the election outcome.
Yes, and obviously the subject of ranked choice voting in Maine has been the subject of a lot of legal challenges, a lot of judicial decisions back and forth. But here we are, about 3 weeks ahead of the election, and I think it's pretty well set that they're going to use it. And you're right, this will be fascinating from that standpoint alone, and factor in the close race, and it could be really, really interesting. And we'll see how the results come out on that one. Now, the third one that you mentioned, and this is basically doubly nice, is the state of Georgia. Both U.S. Senate seats are up this year, so I imagine there's just a lot to talk about related to Georgia.
Yeah, that's right. So there are 2 Senate races taking place in Georgia this year. Both of them have the potential to advance to a runoff. Both of them are looking competitive. Let's start with the regularly scheduled election. Republican Senator David Perdue is running for a second term. He faces Democrat John Ossoff, who is an unsuccessful U.S. House candidate for a special election in suburban Atlanta in 2017. But there's also a third candidate on the ballot, Libertarian Shane Hazel. And what makes this really interesting is having that third candidate on the ballot makes it possible for one candidate, or for no candidate, to win 50% plus 1 in outright majority. Georgia law actually requires that a candidate win 50% plus 1 in order to win election. So should the situation occur that none of the 3 candidates reaches that 50% majority on election day, the top 2 finishers would advance to a runoff on January 5th. Now, Georgia's other Senate seat is up for a special election this year. Republican Senator Johnny Isakson retired midway through his term last year. Interim Senator Kelly Loeffler is actually up against no fewer than 20 challengers in the special election for the remainder of his term. And this is because under Georgia law, special elections for Congress don't have primaries. Instead, any candidate who files for the seat will appear on the general election ballot automatically. And the same stipulation applies where a candidate does need to win 50% or more of the vote. Now, aside from Loeffler, polling suggests that there are 3 other candidates who have a good shot at potentially winning outright or advancing to the runoff. And those are Republican Representative Doug Collins and Democrats Raphael Warnock and Matt Lieberman. But with 21 candidates on the ballot, it's going to be an uphill climb for any one of them to reach that 50% threshold.
Yeah, I haven't read or heard from anybody who thinks that race won't go to a runoff, which means it's very possible that control of the Senate will be totally up for grabs, as you say, into that runoff in January. Okay, we could talk about these Senate races and even a bunch more pretty much for hours, and not just because in and of themselves as statewide elections, there's some really, really neat dynamics. Say in Montana, where you have the incumbent Governor Steve Bullock running against incumbent Senator Steve Daines. You have so many of these stories, but we kind of have to move on. And let's just transition next down the line to the House of Representatives. Obviously, all 435 seats are up, as they are every other year. What can you tell us about the elections there?
Yeah, so currently Democrats hold a 232 seat majority. Republicans have 197 seats. 1 seat is held by a Libertarian, and the remaining 5 seats are vacant. You need 218 seats to get a majority in the House of Representatives. If we count the vacant seats under the party that last held them, this means that Republicans would need to gain a net of 17 seats to take the House, while Democrats would need to lose fewer than 15 seats or gain seats in order to keep their majority. Now, we won't get into the specific numbers, but each of the 3 forecasting outlets, if you look at what seats they're projecting as leaning towards one party or another and set aside any of the seats that they're calling toss-ups, each of the 3 election forecasters are predicting that Democrats have enough seats that lean their way to keep their House majorities even without winning any of the toss-ups. Now, for our part, Ballotpedia has identified 41 battleground districts that we say have a good chance of flipping. This includes 20 seats that are held by Democrats, 20 seats that are held by Republicans, and 1 seat that's held by a Libertarian. And one way or another, we can certainly expect a large number of close races this year. In 2018, there were actually 8 US House elections that were decided by a final margin of under 1 percentage point.
Yeah, there were a lot of really close races in the House in 2018. And as you say, a lot of folks are thinking that that will also be the case this year as well. So the House is going to be something that, because of the timing of when ballots are going to be counted, we're going to be looking at this story probably for quite a while. Now, before we go on to look at what's happening in the states, let's briefly touch on what we kind of, sometimes refer to as split districts. Essentially, they're districts that are held by a member of the U.S. House that's different than how that district voted in the most recent presidential election. So there are 30 U.S. House districts that are represented by a Democrat, where Donald Trump won that district in 2016. And there are 5 U.S. House districts that are represented currently by a Republican, that those districts were carried by Hillary Clinton in 2016. So is there anything that you can tell us about those districts, Dave?
Yeah, let's start with the 30 Trump Democrat districts. So these districts backed Donald Trump by an average margin of 6.2 percentage points. And that is actually a really broad range. It goes from 0.7 percentage points in Illinois' 17th, all the way up to 30.8 percentage points in Minnesota's 7th. In the 2018 midterm elections, these districts backed Democratic candidate by an average margin of 6.4 percentage points. And that ranges from 24.2 in Illinois' 17th, all the way down to a 0.3 percentage point margin in Utah's 4th. Of those 39 Democrats who are in Trump districts this year, of those 30 districts, 29 of them actually have the incumbent running for re-election. There's only 1 retirement, and that's Dave Loebsack in Iowa's 2nd district. Now, there's also 5 Clinton Republican districts. These backed Clinton by an average margin of 11 percentage points. Her widest margin was 24.4 percentage points in North Carolina's 2nd, all the way down to 2 percentage points in Pennsylvania's 1st. And in 2018, these districts backed Republican candidates by an average margin of 5.4 percentage points. That goes from 0.4 percentage points for Will Hurd in Texas's 23rd, all the way up to 13.2 percentage points in North Carolina's 6th. Of these 5 Republicans, 3 of them are retiring this year. The 2 who are running for re-election are Brian Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania and John Katko in New York.
Yeah, I know those districts will get a lot of attention, especially given the fact that their voting pattern in 2018 was, different than what it was in 2016. So those are definitely going to be races that folks will be keeping an eye on, especially as the results come in. They're probably, they're spread throughout the country to see if any, trends emerge in those kind of races. All of that's very interesting. All right, we've talked about the federal races, then Senate, House. Let's look at state government, and let's do that for the remainder of the time that we have. So there's 42 state governments that will be subject to election. Voters will decide partisan control, either in the form of possibly voting for governor or for state legislative chambers. And the implications of these elections could impact how folks, policy is made and the control of states and state governments. So let's look first at the gubernatorial races. So there are 11 states that elect a governor this year. 7 currently have a Republican incumbent, 4 currently have a Democratic governor, and 9 of those 11 feature an incumbent that's running for re-election. There's only 2 that are open seats. One is in Montana, as I mentioned before. Incumbent Governor Steve Bullock is running for the Senate, and also there's an open seat in Utah. Now, I know we at Ballotpedia have identified 6 of these races as battleground races. What can you tell us about any of these gubernatorial races?
Yeah, I'm just going to go through all 6 really quickly. We'll start with Indiana. Indiana has a Republican governor, Eric Holcomb. He is running for a 2nd term against Democrat Woody Myers and Libertarian Donald rainwater. In Missouri, the Republican Governor Mike Parson is actually running for his first fall term against the Democratic State Auditor Nicole Galloway, as well as Green Party candidate Jerome Bauer and Libertarian Rick Combs. This is Parson's first election for governor in his own right. He was elected lieutenant governor in 2016 and succeeded to the governorship after Eric Greitens' resignation in 2018. Montana's gubernatorial race, as you mentioned earlier, is for an open seat. The Democratic governor, Steve Bullock, is running for Senate. Bullock's lieutenant governor, Mike Cooney, is the Democratic nominee. He faces Republican U.S. Representative Greg Gianforte, Green Party nominee Robert Barb, and Libertarian Lyman Bishop. New Hampshire and Vermont, I'm going to group together. They both have Republican governors running for a third two-year term. These are both states with a Republican governor that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. In New Hampshire, Governor Chris Sununu faces Democratic State Senate Majority Leader Dan Feltus and Libertarian Darrell Perry. And in Vermont, the Republican Governor Phil Scott is actually running against the Democratic Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman. And finally, that brings us to North Carolina. In North Carolina, Democratic Governor Roy Cooper is running for a second term against Republican Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest, Constitution Party candidate Al Pisano, and Libertarian Stephen DeFiore II. And we can expect that there might be a close race in North Carolina. Last time around in 2016, the outcome was not known until several weeks after the election. Roy Cooper ended up defeating the incumbent Republican Governor Pat McCrory 49% to 48.8%. So each of those six races promises to be really interesting this year.
Yeah, and one of the things that that I noticed as you were talking is that there are two of those races where the sitting governor is running against the incumbent lieutenant governor. Obviously, those are states where the offices are elected separately, and just happen to be situations where the governor and lieutenant governor are from different parties. So that's going to create a very interesting dynamic. All right, so let's get to the last part of the webinar, and that's talking about trifectas. Trifectas exists when one party controls both the state's governorship and also both chambers of the state legislature. And when a party holds a trifecta, they generally have the ability to move their agenda forward in terms of policymaking without needing to get as much support from the minority party. And obviously, every state's different and every issue is different, but as a whole, it does tend to give one party a little bit more control about what's going on. So currently, there are 21 states that have a Republican trifecta. Those are coded in red on that map. There are 15 with a Democratic trifecta that are coded as blue. And then there are 14 states that are under divided government where neither party has a trifecta, either because, generally because either the legislature is split, which I think only happens in Minnesota, or where the governor and the state legislature are controlled by different parties. So there's also a case in Alaska where Republicans control the governorship and the state Senate, but the state house is operating under a power sharing agreement that was instituted after the 2018 elections. So I mentioned Minnesota, I mentioned Alaska, and of the other 14, there are 4 states that have a Republican governor and a Democratic controlled state legislature, and there are 8 that are the opposite of that. They have a Democratic governor and a Republican state legislature. So that's the breakdown of where things are right now as we stand here almost 3 weeks before the election. So Ballotpedia has identified 16 trifectas. There are 8 Democratic and 8 Republican that we think are vulnerable this year. And we've also identified 7 states that currently don't have a trifecta that have a chance of gaining one. So obviously that's quite a few states. The 23, it's almost half the states. So David, what can you tell us about the chances of some of these trifectas changing?
Yeah, so we assessed 3 Democratic trifectas as being somewhat vulnerable. Those are the 3 that are in the darker shade of blue on the map: Delaware, Illinois, and New Mexico. These are trifectas that we think could break, but are still more likely than not to hold. We also assessed 5 Democratic trifectas as moderately vulnerable, meaning that they had a good chance of breaking, but also a good chance of holding. and those are Colorado, Connecticut, Maine, Nevada, and Oregon. 5 of the 8 vulnerable Democratic trifectas, those being the trifectas in Colorado, Illinois, Maine, New Mexico, and Nevada, were all actually formed as a result of the 2018 elections, so they're still quite recent. We also assessed 3 Republican trifectas as somewhat vulnerable: Ohio, Texas, and South Carolina. And then Arizona, Georgia, Iowa, and West Virginia were Republican trifectas that we assessed as being moderately vulnerable. Florida's Republican trifecta was the only trifecta that we assessed as being highly vulnerable this year. Now, there are also 7 states where new trifectas have a good chance of forming. Democrats have a chance to gain a trifecta in Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, while Republicans have chances to gain trifectas in Alaska and New Hampshire. Both parties have a chance to gain a trifecta in Montana and North Carolina, although I will note that in Montana, Republicans have a much better chance of gaining a trifecta than Democrats. Now, as part of this analysis, we also calculated, just hypothetically, what would a best case scenario look like for each party? So to construct a party's best case scenario, we imagined what it would look like if that party gained every single one of their potential new trifectas, held every single one of their vulnerable trifectas, and the other party lost all of their vulnerable trifectas. So this is the best case scenario for Democrats. It would entail 19 states with Democratic trifectas, 13 with Republican trifectas, and 18 with divided government. So under this scenario, 48% of the US population, nearly half the country, would live in a Democratic trifecta, and 13% would live under a Republican trifecta. Now, on the other hand, the best case scenario for Republicans entails 25 states with Republican trifectas, 6 with Democratic trifectas, and 19 with divided government. And under this scenario, 45% of the US population would live in a Republican trifecta and 26% under a Democratic trifecta.
Yeah, it really is fascinating to see those maps and see really what is at stake and what could potentially change as a result of these elections. And it's also interesting that a lot, I mean, all of these are affected by, up to 7,800 or 8,000 individual state legislative races that are happening in most of the states across the country. So this election obviously is being talked about with the presidential race and congressional races, but obviously there is a lot that could be a substantial effect that could result in state policy and state government control as well. So this has been really, really fascinating. As I said, we could go on, but I think we've pretty much hit our limit. But I want to thank you, David, for joining us to talk about all this.
Thanks for having me on, Dave. It was my pleasure to be here.
All right. So I hope this gave you a little bit of a taste of all of the things that are really at stake in this election and are going to be decided as we come into the last 2 or 3 weeks. All of us here at Ballotpedia are getting more and more excited for the results to start coming in. I said this in our last webinar, we're all kind of like kids that are getting ready for Christmas morning. So that's the excitement that we're feeling. So we're your destination here at Ballotpedia to stay on top of all that's going on. Now, we didn't really talk about the presidential race here today, but you can follow it on our daily newsletter. We have a newsletter called the Daily Presidential News Briefing and provides a really great and quick summary each business day of all the news that's happening in the presidential race. You'll want to subscribe for the final few weeks leading up to the elections and also in the event of any aftermath. So just go to our homepage, scroll down to the featured newsletter section, and there's a link there. You can click on today's issue, and there's also a link there to subscribe as well, and it's free. So we also invite you to keep in the know with all of our email newsletters, including the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our weekly news summary, The Tap. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone.